Support for this program comes from Jazz on the Tube, the Internet's largest collection of free streamable classic jazz videos. From Miles Davis to Louis Armstrong, from Thelonious Monk to Duke Ellington. You'll find it all on jazzonthetube.com. Start your free subscription today.
Hi, and welcome to Jazz Talk, a Jazz on the Tube podcast. My name is Ken McCarthy, and this is where we talk with people who are doing important work that supports and illuminates the music we love. The writers, the scholars, the educators, the filmmakers, the producers, and more.
And today we're talking to a guest we've had before, and we're very happy to have him back again, Dave Oliphant. Welcome, Dave.
Thank you. Great to be here.
And we could talk a whole lot about Dave's career, but we're just going to focus on his writings on jazz. I mean, he is a scholar in the history of jazz. He's got a textbook, actually, on the history of swing music in the United States, and he's also done some great scholarship on the jazz that came out of Texas. And, you know, we're all aware of New York and the Big Apple, and New Orleans gets mentioned a lot as an important place in jazz history, and sometimes people will include Chicago and Kansas City. But as I've spoken with other guests about this, it's not a complete picture. Jazz really came from everywhere, and some of the places that we don't think much about as being major jazz centers, like San Francisco, for example, contributed an enormous amount to the music. And when you look at what Texas did, and it became clear to me when I was reading one of Dave's many books, Texan Jazz, when you take a really good look at all the musicians who came out of Texas, everybody from Scott Joplin, who was the ragtime king, to Ornette Coleman, who was the leader of the avant-garde jazz movement, and a whole lot of artists in between. I'll just reel off a few, and this is a short list: Scott Joplin, Teddy Wilson, Red Garland, Cedar, Walton, Horace Tapscott, Joe Sample, and those are just the pianists. On the bass, we've got Gene Ramey. On drums, we've got all kinds of people like Nesbert Sticks Hooper, Ronald Shannon Jackson. On guitar, Eddie Durham, Charlie Christian, Herb Ellis, Larry Coryell, really strong on guitar. On piccolo, we've got Hubert Laws. We've also got Hubert Laws on flute, and also Prince Lachey and John Carter and James Clay and Leo Wright. On alto, Buster Smith, Eddie Cleanhead Vincent, Jimmy Ford, John Handy, Leo Wright, Prince Lachey, John Carter, Julius Hemphill. And on tenor, and Texas is known for its tenors, so this is a long list: Herschel Evans, Bud Johnson, Tex Beneke, Buddy Tate, Ornette Cobb, John Hardy, Illinois Jacquette. Even though his name was Illinois, he was from Texas. Booker Irvin, John Carter, King Curtis, James Clay, David Fathead Newman, Jesse Powell, Dewey Redman, Marcel Ivory, Wilton Felder, and Billy Harper. And if we read all the other names, we'd be here all day. So I think people get the idea. A whole lot of talent came out of Texas. And one of the artists that I want to focus on today, who was also a tenor player, is Ornette Coleman. And the reason for that is Dave is one of the very, very few people I've ever talked with who is intimately familiar and thoroughly loves and reveres the great swing music of past days, but is also a super fan of Ornette Coleman's work. And people you typically take one side or the other. They're either very focused on the avant-garde or they're very focused on the swing music of the 20s, 30s, 40s. And I see the music as having a lot of similarities, and I think Dave obviously does too. So, Dave, let's talk about how you first experienced the music of Ornette Coleman. So I think I can tell everybody you're 80, or you're going to be 80 very soon. Birthday's coming up soon. So Ornette appeared on the scene exactly 60 years ago. So you would have been 20, I guess, if my math's correct.
That's pretty good. Yeah, because I discovered him either in late 1960 or in 61, and bought the Shape of Jazz to Come album, and I immediately loved that music. And I don't know if I can say objectively that I identified with him, because his music sounded like it came from Texas. I mean, I knew that he was a Texan, at least I think I did at the time. But when I heard it, I thought, this guy is speaking my language and speaking to me. And I really responded in that way. One of the pieces that I really loved and still love is called Congeniality on that album. And I had a friend, in fact, he was the one that introduced me to Ornette's music. He was a composer, a native Texan, and he mentioned to me that when he listened to the melody of Congeniality, it sort of sounded like Ornette was singing, "I'm going to Fort Worth." and that's the pronunciation that use here in Texas. They Fort Worth. They don't say Fort Worth. So my friend was catching the intonation and the pronunciation, really, of the birthplace of Ornette, and working it into that theme. And I've mentioned that many times in the past, because it seemed just so perfectly right for what I was hearing.
Now, when Ornette first came out and became a public figure, which was this, I believe, the fall of '59 in New York City. So you discovered him very early on in the public side of his career. Of course, he'd been playing for well over a decade before he became famous. The mythology it was or is that his music was so far out that only the hippest people, the most sophisticated musicians in the world could grasp it, and that traditional, in quotes, jazz fans hated him. That's the myth that's been promulgated. But clearly you didn't think he was beyond the norm. Or every great artist has music beyond the norm, but you didn't think he was a radical, otherworldly departure from the music that you knew and loved growing up in Texas.
No, not really. And I love Don Cherry too, of course, from Oklahoma. And since I had played a trumpet, not well, but had played trumpet in high school and college, I was really impressed with his pocket trumpet playing. And Ornette it just blew my mind. I thought, this is just wonderful. This is music that I can really get into because I identified so much with what I took to be a Texas sound. Again, objectively, I don't know how you could prove that, but that's what my ears told me, that this guy is playing Texan jazz.
Well, one thing that we can almost say objectively is the melodies that Ornette wrote are unbelievable. I mean, they're just such gems of composition. And then the other thing that I think we can say pretty objectively, and you mentioned Don Cherry, is when they played together, wow, were they in the zone together.
In sync, yeah.
Yeah, wow. I mean, just extraordinary, which, by the way, is a characteristic of older jazz.
Sure, absolutely. I mean, Parker and Miles Davis or Parker and Gillespie, I mean, they're just, it's like one person almost.
Yeah, and I don't know that we have that as much in the present era, and it's something that goes even back before bebop.
Sure.
The Blue Devils and, all those amazing Territory bands, Benny Moten Band, the early Count Basie units, they were playing as if they were one body.
fact, that's even true of a band here in Austin in 1923 that recorded in Los Angeles. They were students here at the University of Texas. The group was called Jimmy's Joys. And I've been listening to recently because I was asked to give a talk about one of the members of the band, the prominent singer during the swing era, Smith Ballou, who played banjo in that group. But they really played as one, even though they were improvising the way they did in Dixieland groups, sort of everybody doing his own thing. But it comes out, and at one point in my favorite piece, which is Bugle Call Rag, and it's based on the New Orleans Rhythm Kings version. But one big difference is that in the middle of the piece, the band starts playing The Eyes of Texas, the theme song of the University of Texas. And, I mean, it is so beautiful, so played so together. It's just magnificent. That's to your point about playing together as one. This group really did that. Have you ever heard of that band?
No, I can't say that I have, but boy, that's at the early years of the history of jazz.
Yes, 1923 when King Oliver and Armstrong first recorded. I mentioned this in my book, Jazz Mavericks of the Lone Star State, but I don't really get into it as much as I wish I had at the time. But historically, a really incredible recording.
Well, I guess we need to remember that those groups in the 20s and I guess into the 30s, and it probably persisted into the 40s and 50s for a lot of people, there was no such thing as amplification. In other words,
right.
you had to blend your sound. You had to pay, there wasn't a sound engineer tuning your microphone down to balance the band out. You had to listen.
Right.
And everybody had to listen to each other, and which is something that could be lost in a setting where everybody's electrified and you have a sound engineer doing the listening for you.
I just thought of something as you were talking. I read recently, I hadn't known this before, but this group was so together, and they didn't read. It was all by ear. And their trombone player was going to take a job in San Antonio. His name was Jack Brown, and he was going to take a job there, so they needed a replacement. And somebody recommended a friend who lived in Colorado, and that turned out to be Glenn Miller. So they had him come down to Austin and try out for the trombone position. And he came down, and he couldn't play with them because he could only read, and they weren't readers.
Mm-hmm.
So he didn't get the job.
Wow.
Later, this Smith Ballou had him in his orchestra in the 30s before Glenn Miller got his own band. A strange development.
Absolutely. It reminds me of something that I wanted to bring up in this call, and this is as good a place as any. You introduced me to the sublime artist, Eddie Durham, the Texan, and his amazing life. Possibly, in a field with so many underrated artists, my personal vote is for Eddie Durham as the most underrated jazz great in the whole art. That's where I am today on the subject. And there's a long, winding interview with him, recorded very badly. You really have to strain to hear what's being said. But at one point he said something very interesting, and this is not a racial thing. It's really a cultural thing. And he said, white musicians can play notes 2 different ways, but black musicians can play notes 8 different ways. Now, and I don't think, he was a gentleman and a very kind and intelligent man. Yeah. This was not some kind of racial thing. It's certainly a cultural thing, an upbringing thing. And he was a good musician. Now, for people that don't know who Eddie Durham was, he was the guy that Charlie Christian got the inspiration from to play guitar, or play the guitar the way Charlie Christian played it.
Guitar.
The electric guitar. And you can actually hear Eddie Durham licks in Charlie Christian. Eddie Durham also is according to trombonists, and I'm not a trombonist and I don't know the instrument very well, but if you ask a professional trombonist, they will tell you Eddie Durham, in addition to being an amazing guitar player, also invented a whole approach to trombone, which basically modernized the way the trombone's played. He also did a lot of the writing for the Blue Devils and for Count Basie and
Benny Moten, yeah.
Benny Moten, and was one of the first jazz arrangers to write in 6 parts.
That's right.
You know, pretty impressive. And then, speaking of Glenn Miller, he's in the mood, right, Glenn Miller?
Right.
Okay. It appears that Eddie Durham wrote the arrangement to In the Mood. Now, there are...
Well, that he apparently may have written some parts, but it's not thought that he really... I can't remember the name of the person that's credited, but anyway, there are different views of that.
I've looked really deeply into it, and I'm not saying that my view of it is right. However, I will say the guy that got the credit was very good at getting credit for all kinds of stuff. Like, he was very business-minded and made sure that his name appeared on lots of things. And the other story that I've heard is that it was Glenn Miller himself who put that arrangement together, and that comes from a band member. But when you hear the band member talk about what he experienced, it sounds more to me like Glenn Miller was making adaptations and perfecting, putting the final touches and innovating on something that had already existed. And my further understanding, at least this is from one source that's fairly credible, is that Eddie Durham got $5 for writing the arrangement. but right. Glenn Miller only got 15 because his contract turned over all his arrangements to the money guy that was behind him. So even Glenn Miller didn't get paid for that. So this is certainly a story that is still open to debate and further scholarship. But the point I want to make is Eddie Durham was an amazing musician, and it's very interesting that he made a distinction between the musicianship or the ability to hear, or the things, not even necessarily ability, but what to listen for. And in his statement, he is pretty much implying that someone raised in an Afro-American cultural tradition in that era could play a note 8 different ways, whereas somebody like perhaps Glenn Miller, perfectly good musician, no deficiency at all, really only had 2 ways to do things. And so it was Eddie Durham that said this is what made it difficult in those days, back in those days, for white musicians, and I'm going to say culturally, raised in a certain tradition, to play with musicians raised in an African American tradition, because the African Americans just had bigger ears. They were just listening. Now, this brings us to Ornette.
Absolutely.
I mean, anybody that listens
to... He heard everything.
Wow. Dorothy Donegan once said this about Captain Hyatt, who was a great music instructor in Chicago and taught many, many, many jazz greats, from Sun Ra to Nat King Cole to Johnny Griffin. I mean, you name it, he taught the guys. And Dorothy Donegan said he could hear an ant pee on cotton. And I feel that describes Ornette's acoustic apparatus as well.
So it's also characteristic, I think, of a Texan like Kenny Dorham, who, in my long poem that I compare him to the mockingbird, which is thought to be able to reproduce any sound that he hears. This was true in a way, I think, of people like Kenny Dorham and Ornette Coleman, both of whom got kicked out of the band when they were in high school for jamming.
And of course, Ornette went to I.M. Terrell, and
Kenny went to school here in Austin.
Okay, and he got kicked out too. How do you like that?
Yeah.
Wow. And it was interesting, and maybe this is where we can start talking a little bit about what contributed to Ornette being Ornette. So he went to a high school that had the following students: John Carter, King Curtis, Prince Lachey, Charles Moffett, and Dewey Redman. And later, And those were all people in his class, in his close, either in his class or very close to it. So he was in school with these guys, right? And then, as if that's not enough evidence that something amazing musically was going on in Fort Worth, other graduates of I.M. Terrell include Julius Hemphill, Ronald Shannon Jackson, Cornell Dupree. It's really quite remarkable. So let's talk about the Texas sound, and I'm going to kind of go back again to Eddie Durham, because he grew up riding horses, hunting rattlesnakes, herding cattle. There's a lot of sounds out there in Texas that maybe people in New Orleans or New York City might not ever hear.
Right.
So how much, like for instance, I hear Ornette do the horse whinny or the horse neighing sound every now and then. In other words, he'll be playing a solo, and then he'll go into something that to me sounds like something that's coming from a being, like a horse or something. And we hear that in a lot of early jazz of people.
Yeah, animal sounds. Yeah.
Yeah. The other tradition in Texas, and I don't know if Ornette encountered this, but he associated himself or felt simpatico with Native Americans. Now, of course, I'm going to refer to Eddie Durham a lot, I think, in this call. Eddie Durham, of course, was part Native American and grew up amongst Native Americans. In fact, wore his hair long and braided till he was an adult.
I didn't know.
Oh, yeah. I learned that from that interview. So I don't know in urban Fort Worth in the 1930s. Well, I know people that keep horses to this day in New Orleans.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, there's not a lot of them, but there are people who are handy with horses and that have a horse.
No, animals were in town. I mean, just about everybody had a chicken hen house. My aunt did. We lived next door to them. They had chickens all the time when I was a boy.
All right. So in even though it was a city in the 1930s, when Ornette grew up, because he was born in 1930, he would have been exposed to rural aspects of life. In fact, I can tell people this story. I can tell people this story. When I met Ornette in 1980, he was living in a loft on the Bowery, and it was unheated, and which is rough in New York, I'll tell you. But he had a wood-burning stove, and he knew how to work that wood-burning stove. He had no problem keeping that place warm.
Yeah.
So, and he told me, he said, "Oh, I learned this when I was a kid." So one aspect of the Texas sound is the fact that it's countrified.
Right.
With all those sounds. Now, I guess another aspect would be...
And that's in terms, I think, of speech also. In other words, jazz has always imitated the human voice in different ways, and I think that his playing has a Texas accent in a way.
Well, he spoke with a Texas accent and a Texas style of speaking to the end. He never dropped that. He never became a fast-talking New Yorker like me. What was uncanny is he and Eddie Durham really shared speech pattern. Like if you just blinked for a second, you'd think it was Ornette speaking on this interview. They sounded like brothers. Specific words, specific catchphrases.
Yeah.
They use the same thing. And Ornette, of course, was always very clear that the music was the voice of human beings. Coming from the being. And he was very moved by vocal music. I remember last couple of years of his life, he was very enamored of this one particular Jewish cantor who just sang fantastically. And that was an interesting thing about Ornette too, is that he really had wide tastes. He loved, who was that novelty guy, Spike? Is it Spike Jones?
Spike Jones.
Yeah. He told me he loved Spike Jones. He thought Spike Jones was hilarious. And he went to go see Parliament Funkadelic when they came to the city. He bought his own ticket and went to go. And then he went over to Africa and he was playing with people on the street in a village in Nigeria. And then he went up to the mountains of Morocco, and he was enamored of that music and figured out how he could play with those folks too. So he had very broad ears, and so I'm imagining growing up he had similar broad ears. So, do we know what kind of music people would have heard on a street level, not the stuff that ever was recorded or the stuff that became famous, but I imagine there were jug bands and what I've learned now is spasm bands. I know Ornette told me that when he was a kid, just walking down the street in Fort Worth, you couldn't go a block without hearing live music. Now, it might just be a guy playing a comb with wax paper, or it might be some guy singing, or it might be a guy with a guitar, but it was everywhere. So he was drawing on all of that. And let's talk about another, besides the rural, the countrified aspect of Texas, the blues.
Sure.
I mean, Ornette was clearly, in addition to all the other things he was really a blues man. Any tunes come to mind that feature that aspect of his musicality?
Blues you're talking about?
Yeah, that blues feel, even if it's not, standard.
Isn't it one of the tunes called Blues Connotation?
Yeah, that's the one I was thinking too. And can you talk a little bit about the blues tradition of Texas? I mean, everybody thinks of blues as coming out of the Delta only, and then they may say, oh, well, then there was the electric blues in Chicago. What are they missing when they're not addressing the Texas contribution to blues?
Well, there are just a number of women blues singers, and they were the first to record in Chicago. In my book, I go through a lot of those. Some of them played with, some of them sang on early Armstrong recordings. 1924, right in there. But even before that, I think 23, there were some recordings with blues women from Texas. I'm sorry I can't remember the names, but I go into all that in my book, Texan Jazz. And there was a family in Houston with, it may have been a cousin, I can't remember, they were related though. There was an older brother who was a composer, and then there was a younger brother who was a piano player and is thought to have recorded the first Boogie Woogie, again in Chicago. And so one of the, I believe it was a cousin, might have been a sister, she was very, very important. And both of them recorded with King Oliver. So, I mean, there's a whole history of blues, primarily women. In fact, not until people like,
well, for instance, in your
Blind Jefferson.
Blind Lemon Jefferson.
Right. And then the most famous, Leadbelly, was originally from Louisiana, but he really grew up in Texas and did all of his singing in Dallas and other places. So, I mean, there's a huge history of blues in Texas, and according to Gunther Schuller, he thought that really the blues originated in Texas.
Well, that's provocative. And in your book, Texan Jazz, and believe me, I've written some books, and I know I have to break them out myself just to remind myself of what's in them. People that have it written don't realize we write these things and we do our best, but once it's done, we're on to other things, and we have to reread them ourselves. But the book is Texan Jazz, and you've got three whole chapters devoted to this. You have one chapter on country blues, one chapter on classic blues, and then one chapter indeed on boogie woogie. And a lot of this took place in East Texas. That was a very
Southeast Texas.
So that's sort of between New Orleans and Houston.
Right.
The Piney Woods. My understanding about why one of the reasons that area was so rich culturally is that it was an area of a lot of promise for recently freed enslaved people. So, if you wanted to get out of Mississippi, one of the places you could go, or Arkansas, or one of the Delta places, you could go to East Texas where there were jobs with the timber.
On the railroad, in the lumber industry. And Houston had like a free town. I mean, where it really the inhabitants ran things themselves, really. Yeah, that was a great opportunity, and there were, I don't know, there must have been thousands of people that ended up there.
And then places like Fort Worth, that was a rail center, and imagine a cattle center.
Right.
And so, we have an image of the Depression, and the Depression certainly was hard, but there were pockets in the country that didn't get hit quite as hard as others. And you could enlighten me on this. My impression is that one of the places that did okay were places like Texas, where people weren't tied into factories so much. People had a lot of skills, raising their own food. The cattle industry, I'm sure had a lot of ups and downs during the Depression, but it was basically an ongoing industry, and so there was economic activity in all those Texas cities and towns.
By the time I was born in '39, of course, the Depression was slowly ending, but my dad had work. He was a printer, and I remember, a good life. I don't remember anything like the Depression, and didn't hear my people talk about it. You're right that it didn't really seem to affect that area of Fort Worth and Dallas as much.
Well, probably, I mean, I think the people that got hit the hardest were people that had industrial jobs, and you had this sudden...
And farmers, really, especially in the Dust Bowl.
Oh, of course.
Yeah.
Of course.
But that North Texas was not really affected, even though Oklahoma was hit pretty badly.
Mm-hmm. Hey, let's talk about another tradition of the Texas sound. So we've talked about the countrified nature of Texas, and we've talked about the deep blues roots of Texas. There's also, and this doesn't just apply to Texas, actually, it applied to that era. And again, referring to Eddie Durham, one of his original jobs I was interested to learn was playing in a traveling Wild West show.
Circus? Wild West show, right.
Yeah. And
101, I think it was called.
Yep. And Ornette caught the tail end of that, too. He played with a group called...
Oh, that's right.
The Silas Green.
Yeah.
And
I hadn't thought about that.
Oh yeah. Well, let's talk a little bit about that. Let's talk about the bountiful opportunities for live musicians that existed in that era, and I'm going to say the 20s, the 30s, the 40s even, in these traveling shows. Now, we don't have traveling shows like this anymore, so we can't, and a certain generation can't even visualize them. But can you talk a little bit about these institutions and how they functioned and how they fit into daily society?
Well, the Wild West show that Durham was in traveled all the way up from Texas to New York. So they obviously were profitable, and that would obviously attract the musicians, just as Kansas City drew lots of Texas musicians there because of the Prohibition. The liquor was available at places where the police really didn't raid, thanks to even people like Harry Truman, who was part of the mob there.
Right,
in a way.
Right, part of the establishment.
Right. But Durham had an opportunity even to experiment with his arranging. That's when he began to have 6-part harmony. He talks about that. And so it was at least one very lucrative outlet for musicians. I don't know really that much about it, but it shows that jazz musicians like Durham would take on any kind of music. I mean, and were able to play, as you mentioned, he could play the note 8 different ways. Well, he could also play many different styles. And so many of the early musicians took whatever they could get at the moment and developed their skills, and then eventually ended up in Kansas City and playing in bands that were eventually picked up by the radio, and the rest is history.
The biographer of Robert Johnson, a blues legend, says that he was the same. We have this image, 80 years later or however long it is, that he was just a blues man, and that was all he did, and it was blues 24/7, 360. No, the truth is that, like any working musician, including today, you have to be flexible. And there is documentation of Robert Johnson making it as far as Newark, New Jersey, and playing tarantella, I think that's how you pronounce it, at an Italian wedding. They didn't want to hear blues, they wanted the tarantella.
Right.
And he had enough musical chops to be able to adapt to that and get a payday. So I think, again, we view some of these musicians as mythical beings who just were born playing jazz and that's all they ever did. I'm going to say they probably played every gig, especially in those days, every gig that they could get that paid.
Absolutely.
I mean, wasn't it the Blue Devils that had to break up because they literally ended up on the road completely broke and not able to even feed themselves? So it's a tough life today. It was a really tough life back then. So, we have to remember these tent shows, these traveling tent shows. There was no such thing as amplified music. There was no DJ where they could just bring a sound guy with some big speakers and provide the music. If you wanted music, and you had to have music for these things, you can't have a circus without music. You can't have a Wild West. You can't have any of these things without music. It had to be live.
Yeah.
So this gave all these guys a gig, and it's really interesting when you mentioned Eddie Durham. He started his 6-part harmony arranging while traveling with the Wild West show, and my understanding from that story is the guys would play the boring Wild West overture or whatever it was they had to play, and then at night they'd get together and do what they really wanted musically.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. So Ornette, I did a little research into Ornette's travels with the Silas Green show, and it was a tent show, and it was one-night stands. So they would set up the tent, put on the show, I guess take the tent down in the morning, jump in the trucks or however they got around, get to the next town, get the tent up and do a nut show. And it was just one show after another. And this was one of the rare enterprises that was owned by an Afro-American. And it had changed hands a couple of times, but it ended up under the control, when Ornette was running it, of a guy who was one of the few or maybe the only Afro-Americans to own a circus company. And again, we've got internet, we've got Netflix, we've got sixplex theaters, we've got our iPhones, we've got TV. Back in the 20s and 30s, you had a little radio that was okay, but it wasn't great. And you had a little record player where you had to change the needles every 5 songs, every 5 plays. So if people wanted to have fun, they had to get out of the house and go hear live music.
That's right, and that's where Western swing was so popular here in Texas, which started here, and people really loved to dance to the music, and the musicians loved to play that style, and they were influenced by jazz. So there's a combination of sort of country, Western, and jazz, and great popularity then, and it continues to this day. Western swing is still popular in Texas. I don't know about the rest of the country, but I know some of the bands travel out of here, like Sleep at the Wheel. There's one band from Austin that I think probably travels to the East Coast.
And that's music that Ornette might have heard growing up.
Yes, absolutely. I was thinking about that earlier.
One of the things that he did later in his career was he had 2 guitar players, electric guitar players, in his band simultaneously. Now it wasn't Western swing for sure, but these players were very knowledgeable about blues and rhythm and blues and all that classic guitar sound, and they did different things with what they knew, but they were both steeped. Those both 2 guitar players that I'm thinking of, Bern Nix and Charlie Ellerby, they were absolutely steeped in those rhythm and blues riffs. And it was a Texan rhythm and blues guitar player who brought Ornette he had a little, he did his tour with the Silas Green, then he did some other stuff. He landed or was stranded in New Orleans for a bit, but then he ended up in L.A., and it was Pee Wee Clayton, the R&B guitar player. Now that's another element of the Texas sound, R&B.
The R&B, yeah.
And now that's where you get the tenor, the honking tenors, and
exactly, yeah.
Did you ever witness any of that? Where people would, lie on their backs and play, just go wild.
I saw things similar to that on early TV, but I never experienced it in person.
But that was, and I did speak with Ornette about this, that was a real thing, and there was a lot of showbiz.
Yeah, he talks about especially the tenors that influenced him from R&B.
And, of course, people may not be aware of this, but Ornette was a tenor player, and he picked up the alto when he was on the road, and he had a mishap with some ruffians, some bad guys, and his tenor got busted up. So he ended up penniless and, like any of us would if we were in that situation. And he was taken in by the Lasky family of New Orleans, a great musical family. He lived in the lower 9th Ward, which was a very countrified place, he told me, in those days. Everybody had a garden, everybody had chickens, there were horses in the street,
Yeah.
But that's where he picked up the alto. So he had been playing tenor all the way until that mishap. Now, you reminded me earlier, before this call, of the great Ornette tenor album.
Ornette on tenor.
Yeah, yeah. Now
I love that. I really love that album.
Yeah, and I think it might be a surprise to a lot of people that Ornette played tenor at all. And when you listen to that, he was as much of a virtuoso as he was on alto. He was
He was. He really was. And it's not the kind of tenor that you would think of. I mean, it's just a totally different approach to the instrument and a totally different sound. It's just not like any tenor I ever heard. And it's still a tenor, but it's really, I don't know of another album like it by any tenor player.
You know, this great contemporary player, David Murray, who's a tenor player, and years ago, it was early 80s, maybe 80 itself, he said, wow, everybody's sleeping on Ornette on tenor. You know, and he got a lot of mileage from studying that record in his own development. Let's talk a little bit about the tenor, because the tenor seems to be, if there is a native jazz instrument, of course there's all, great trumpet players, great guitar players, great pianists, great everything came out of Texas, but Texas does get associated with the Texas tenors. What can you tell us about that tradition, and how it came to be, and the distinct Texas sound? And
well, it's very interesting that speaking of Eddie Durham, that his cousin was Herschel Evans, who really is the first. He and Bud Johnson are really the earliest recorded tenors, and both became members, of major bands, Count Basie and the piano player that recorded with Armstrong.
Father Hines?
Yeah, Father Hines. Bud Johnson was called the straw boss in that band. And then, of course, Illinois Jacquet and Ornette Cobb, and just so many early tenors. And Ornette has said that Texas Honk, that he was attracted to mostly through the R&B sound, but that had already been established by Illinois Jacquet and Hampton's band in early 40s. So a long tradition, and Ornette fits right in there. But again, what he does with the instrument is just phenomenal. Coltrane, of course, revolutionized it too, but Ornette just he does something quite different. I don't know if I could define it, but anyone interested should check out that Ornette on tenor album.
You mentioned the honking, Ornette would occasionally throw out a few honks,
Sure,
even in the midst of these, scorching melodic lines. And by the way, I want to encourage anybody who thinks that those lines are random, take the fastest Ornette Coleman line you can find and slow it down to half speed or a quarter speed, and you're going to be shocked. Every one of those notes is articulated. He's not slurring around. He's not. It sounds like, because I guess he had ears that we can't even imagine, and he heard what he was doing.
To me, that's where it comes out more than ever, is in that tenor album. Although on alto, just he did things that no one else has done.
Well, it's interesting because it was the tenor where he became Ornette Coleman. That was the first instrument he had as a kid, and he was playing and I wish we knew more about this. Gosh, how I wish wish we could talk with him. But I know that as a kid, he was playing gigs to support his family.
Sure.
Now, this is another sort of another, not just for Texas, but part of the Texas story, is he was playing in what is called, and what he called, gut bucket saloons. And he says these places were really rough. Like, he saw major physical violence go down.
Yeah.
And it wasn't unusual. And it was very, he was a young kid. He's a very sensitive person. He was a sensitive person till his last day. So I can only imagine what impact that had on a young child who has a very sensitive nature. But he saw people getting stabbed. He saw it all. And I imagine there was quite a lively set of entertainment options available for the stock workers, the people that worked in the stockyards, and the people that worked in the slaughterhouses, and I imagine it was a rough crowd, but it was a rough crowd that got paid every Friday and had money to go out and spend. So that was another source of opportunity to play music for him.
Yeah.
So I guess sort of the gut bucket, that kind of is a Western thing. We don't have gut bucket saloon. We probably had equally bad things in New York in the olden days, but we don't think in terms of gut buckets. But apparently that was a cultural feature of Texas and Nevada and Arizona. So we're talking about Ornette. We're talking about getting the human voice, but specifically, perhaps the Texas voice through the instrument. We're talking about someone deeply rooted in the blues. Even if he's not playing standard blues form, he certainly has a blues feel.
Right.
We've got that honk, tenor honk. We've got that countrified thing. He's got several tunes that almost sound like country music. And interestingly enough,
right, that's right.
Let's talk about Charlie Hayden. Who grew up as an infant practically. He was singing with his country music performing family.
No, it's easy. It's easy for those musicians to transition from one type of music to another, which they grew up with. They grew up hearing blues and country western. Hispanic music, of course, is very appealing to Ornette. He has a number of pieces that are in Spanish. I mean, the words of the titles are in Spanish or have a Spanish rhythm, sound, and obviously it made an impact. It just became one of many styles and sounds of music that they heard and incorporated into their own playing.
Well, the fact that that Charlie Hayden and Ornette both came from, we'll say, countrified backgrounds, I never really thought about that before, by the way. This is the first time and I bet many people haven't. We tend to think of these guys as, you know, they're so sophisticated. We just assume they came from, you know, very, you know, elevated, sophisticated surroundings, you know. But we could both say they were basically country boys, even though Ornette grew up in Ornette, I mean, in a city. Well, I mean, when you saw him handle that wood burning stove, I mean, he was, you know, he clearly knew what he was doing, and he knew how to get that thing to light up fast and get the most heat out of it and keep the smoke from coming out. So
right, that was very important.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll tell you, the one time I tried, I smoked the whole place up. It was a disaster. But yeah, I never thought of the fact that they both, because we see Ornette as the New Yorker. He moved to New York in '59, and he was, at that point, he became a New Yorker. That was his base. He even told me he didn't want to be anywhere else because he felt, in terms of getting the art out and broadcasting it as widely as he possibly could, the only place that he could be to do that was New York. So from '59 to when he passed away just a few years ago, which was a pretty long stretch of time, we think of him as the New Yorker. And because of the fact that he's the grandfather of the avant-garde, we're imagining this, you know, academic, theoretical guy, you know, but really his roots are Texan, and they are countrified, you know,
Yeah.
You know, one thing I meant to say is that, do you ever hear kind of a circus feel or a tent show feel in his music?
I think you could say that. Yeah.
So I have a feeling that's another element that we're hearing. You know, it would be interesting for a young scholar who's got a lot of time on his hands to take some of the early Ornette stuff, like maybe '59, and literally go through every one of those original tunes and identify, wow, this sounds Spanish or Hispanic, and this sounds like a horse whinnying, and this sounds like a gut bucket rhythm and blues saloon, and this sounds like a circus. I think people, if they pick through Ornette's music that way, they're going to be rewarded very richly with a new vision of what informed him. Because, you know, what is a great artist? A great artist is a guy that takes the materials that he's been given and turns them into something incredible. Well, the materials that Ornette was given was being born in 1930 in Fort Worth.
I picked up my copy of Sound Museum, which of course is a very late CD. You just look at some of the titles. He's got city living, but of course he grew up in a city, but as you say, it was really more like country. I actually lived on the very edge of Fort Worth myself, and it was like being in the country almost.
Mm-hmm.
And then he has another one called Homegrown, kind of a down-home idea. And then he has PP, Piccolo Pesos, which of course is Spanish, and the tune is Hispanic or Latin sounding. And of course he has a variation on What a Friend We Have in Jesus, and we haven't said anything about the church. And although I don't know much about Ornette's ideas on religion, he certainly heard church music, hymns, and knew them, and obviously could work them in. And here's another one, Macho Woman. It's so another Spanish title, that is, Macho. Yeah, your idea that you could catalog a wide range of sounds that appear or can be heard in his music, great idea for a young scholar.
Well, you know what? Speaking of the religious music angle, I don't know, and maybe somebody has documented what his upbringing was in that regard in Fort Worth. I have a feeling, like so many Afro-American families of that era, that the church was such an important survival institution for the whole community that it would be kind of amazing if he didn't have some involvement.
No, he couldn't avoid it.
Yeah, he would have, even if he didn't go, even if his family didn't go, everybody around him went, and there would have certainly been a big influence. But I can tell you this, and not many people know this story, and you know, when he got stranded in New Orleans, the Lasky family that he stayed with not only were musicians, they were also very strong church people. And they were involved in that religion. Oh, I don't want to call it holy rollers, because it's, well, I mean, that's a descriptive term. It's not meant to be a derogatory term, but it's kind of super Pentecostal, like rolling in the aisles, literally. I mean, that's part of it. Possession, you know, I mean, if it was Cuba or Brazil, we would say it's spirit possession. And you do see that, and I saw that in Cuba. I'll tell you what, that is real. But of course, in a Christian context, you can't really talk about spirit possession. But it's a very similar thing where people go into a non-ordinary state of mind, and that's part of the purpose of the service. There's
certainly a lot to be said about Ornette as a spiritual person.
Mm-hmm.
Whether he was interested in denominations, I doubt it. But he would have heard the music of the black church, and he, as you said, was a sensitive person, and that comes out in the sort of spirituality of his own music. I don't know if many people listening to it would think of that, but I always felt that there was a lot of spirituality in his music.
Well, the seriousness, you know, if you ever had a chance to see him play, or when you see any serious musicians play, there's a level of intensity and focus that is, I think, addressing something beyond entertainment, beyond art even. It's almost, well, was it Dizzy Gillespie said that Africans play with music, and every time I pick up my horn, I'm praying?
Yeah, right.
So the thing I wanted to say about Ornette's experience in New Orleans is he did attend these services that featured, we'll call it a non-ordinary state of mind. And there was a band, of course, because of course there's going to be music in a church, in a church, and he played in the band, and with his alto, and because his tenor had been busted up. And I don't know if many people know this story, but he told me, and I actually have it on tape, that it was in that context, because when the band, you know, the band had a routine, of course, as all bands do, but once things started heating up, well, then things started getting a lot looser, you know? And he said he was able to do things musically and not be ridiculed or shamed or beaten up or threatened or thrown off the bandstand. He was able to do things musically in that church setting that he found to be very liberating personally, and that was a very important experience for him in the formation of his life as an artist, because there he was playing what he was feeling. Playing what he was feeling and letting it rip, and not having to worry about somebody going, "Hey, Coleman, stop soloing," right? Because he got thrown, like you pointed out, he got thrown out of his high school band.
And he got run out of a place in Los Angeles too.
Oh, that's right. That's right. He was, you know, and then in I believe it was Baton Rouge, some guys took such exception to him, his playing, and in those days I think he had a very unique style. I think he had long hair, and he just was an unusual looking guy, and there were people that find that anybody different offensive, and that's how he lost his tenor. They met him after the show and roughed him up and smashed his instrument. So he experienced a lot of rejection, and so here he is in church in this particular setting, able to just do it, you know, do what he felt like doing, and he was free. You know, he was free to do it. So I hope this call inspires people to go and listen to some Ornette Coleman, and if you've heard a lot of Ornette's music, listen to it again and see if perhaps you're hearing some of these things that Dave has pointed out. And I want to thank Dave for educating me and introducing me to the idea that Ornette Coleman, because I knew him as a New Yorker, you know, and I kind of knew he was from Texas, you know, well, everybody's from somewhere, but I never thought through the implications of what it meant that Ornette was a Texan. And thanks to Dave and his scholarship and his just love of the music on top of all the great scholarship, it got me listening to Ornette in a different way. So I hope it helps you all to do the same. And Dave, thank you so much for this time and these beautiful, wonderful books that you've written. Texan Jazz, I recommend to everybody. Tell me the title of the Mavericks book again. I have it. I just don't have it.
Jazz Mavericks of the Lone Star State.
Yeah, so if you like Texan Jazz, definitely you're going to love Jazz Mavericks of the Lone Star State. Well, actually, it's coming up soon.
Yeah.
If everybody is around on, is it July 18th?
Right.
Okay. That's Dave's 80th birthday, and if I could, I would be in Fort Worth, or I'd be in Austin visiting you. But what we're going to do instead, thanks to the magic of the internet, is we have a recording of Dave reading from this wonderful, wonderful epic, truly an epic poem that he wrote about Kenny Durham called KD. And we're going to be debuting that as a recording, at least, on the 18th of July right here on Jazz on the Tube. So Dave, I want to wish you an early happy birthday.
Thank you, and thank you for a real learning experience. I always learn so much every time we talk.
Oh, vice versa, and I hope we're spreading, I know the love you have for this music, I know the love I have for it, and I hope these conversations are helping people that love the music find even new ways to love it.
Thanks again.
We hope you enjoyed the podcast. If you did, please share it. That's how we grow. And remember to subscribe to JazzOnTheTube.com, the Internet's largest collection of free, streamable, classic jazz videos.